The January wind coming off Lake Michigan was brutal that night. I stepped out of the terminal at O'Hare a little after 10 p.m. Dragging a suitcase, packed with presentation boards from a week-long design conference in Seattle. My throat burned, my head felt heavy, and after 3 miserable days of fighting the flu, I was barely functioning. All I wanted was to get home, take some medicine, and sleep. Then I saw Reed's silver Lexus waiting at the arrivals curb. For a moment, my tired heart lifted. We'd been married for 4 years, and seeing him there reminded me of the man he had been when we first met. The thoughtful husband who always kept a bottle of water in the cup holder because he knew how much I hated airports. I smiled and walked toward the car. But something was wrong. The trunk didn't open. The hazard lights didn't blink. The passenger window lowered only a few inches. "Reed?" I called, pulling my suitcase through the slush. "I didn't even text you. How did you know I landed?" "Oh." He barely looked up from his phone. "I can't take you home. Something came up with the Kessler account. Patterson called an emergency meeting. I have to be downtown in 20 minutes. I stared at him. "It's 10:30 at night. Oh. "I know what time it is, Audrey." His eyes met mine for barely a second. There was no warmth in them, no concern, just calculation. "There's a rideshare pickup on level 2. I'll Venmo you for the fare." I should have been angry. Instead, I noticed the scarf. It was lying across the passenger headrest, ivory silk decorated with tiny red flowers, elegant, delicate, obviously feminine. It wasn't mine. I wore thick sweaters all winter because I was constantly cold, and I knew that scarf hadn't been there 3 weeks earlier when I'd borrowed Reed's Lexus to deliver equipment to a client. "Reed," I said slowly, "whose scarf is that?" His hand moved immediately. He grabbed it and pushed it into the glove compartment. No hesitation, no surprise, no guilty reaction, just a smooth, practiced motion. "My mother's. She left it here last week." His voice remained perfectly calm. "Audrey, I really have to go." The window rolled up. The Lexus pulled away. Then the rear tire hit a puddle of dirty slush and sent freezing water straight across my coat. My good charcoal wool coat, the one I'd saved for 3 months to buy. I stood there watching his taillights disappear into the traffic, soaked through, shivering, and burning with a fever. I had $43 in my wallet. My phone had 3% battery, and my husband had just left me alone at the airport. I made it back inside and found a charging kiosk near baggage claim. My hands were trembling so badly that it took 4 attempts to connect the charger. A Chicago Department of Aviation employee noticed me struggling and pointed toward an old landline mounted on the wall. An actual corded telephone. I hadn't seen one in years. I called Pam from memory. She answered on the second ring. I told her where I was. She said only 2 words. "Don't move." After that, everything became blurry. I remember the terminal floor seeming strangely soft beneath me. Then nothing. Pam later told me she'd found me slumped against the kiosk wall. The paramedics discovered that what I thought was a bad case of the flu had developed into pneumonia somewhere during my flight home. My body had simply stopped keeping up. Pam took me to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I spent 4 days there. After that, she brought me to her apartment in Wicker Park so I could recover. 10 days passed. I knew because Pam kept a tally on the calendar she used for her meal prep schedule. Every morning she'd add another mark, and every morning she'd silently place my phone in front of me. The call log never changed. 0 missed calls from Reed. No voicemail, no text, not even a simple question asking whether my flight had landed safely. Nothing. 10 days. 10 days while I lay in a hospital bed. 10 days while I recovered on Pam's couch with a pulse ox monitor clipped to my finger. 10 days while the man I'd shared a home with for 4 years apparently never thought to pick up his phone. On the morning of day 11, I finally sat up without help. "I want coffee," I said. Pam smiled. Now that's progress. She made it and placed my phone beside the mug. I stared at the empty screen for a long time. Then I thought about the scarf, about the way Reed had hidden it. He hadn't flinched, he hadn't panicked. He hadn't even looked surprised. He had simply covered it, like someone hiding evidence of something that had become routine. That gesture had been practiced. And suddenly, I realized something that frightened me more than the scarf itself. Maybe this hadn't started recently. I didn't call Reed. I wanted to know how long it would take him to notice I was gone. That evening, his Lexus finally pulled into our driveway in Elmhurst. I knew because Cora texted me. She lived 4 blocks away and had been quietly watching the house for me ever since I'd contacted her from Pam's apartment. I'll explain why later. Reed entered the house and found it dark. The kitchen was cold. The counters had gathered a thin layer of dust, the kind that appears when nobody has been home for days and the Roomba hasn't been running. He called Mrs. Patton, our part-time housekeeper. Cora happened to be nearby when she heard him through the side window. His first question wasn't whether I was safe. It wasn't whether I'd been hurt. It wasn't even whether I'd made it home. He sounded irritated. "Where's Audrey? Why hasn't she been in touch with you? Why does the house look like this?" Mrs. Patton told him she hadn't seen me since before I left for Seattle. She said she'd tried calling several times to arrange the cleaning schedule, but my phone went straight to voicemail. She'd assumed Reed and I had gone somewhere together for the holidays. Then, according to Cora, Reed's voice changed. That polished boardroom confidence suddenly cracked. He asked Mrs. Patton to repeat herself. She did, and that's when I knew something important had happened, because Reed hadn't been worried about me for 10 days. He hadn't wondered where his wife was. He hadn't called the hospital. He hadn't contacted my friends. He hadn't even noticed that I wasn't home. He only became concerned when he walked into an empty house and realized something was wrong. And then there was Cora, Reed's half-sister. Their father had a daughter from a relationship before he married Roberta, and that daughter was Cora. For most of their lives, Reed's family treated Cora and her mother like an embarrassing secret they'd rather keep buried. When Reed's father died 3 years earlier, Reed handled the estate. The will had clearly provided for Cora, but somehow she received almost nothing. She fought him in court. By the time everything was settled, her legal bills had swallowed nearly as much as the settlement itself. Cora eventually walked away, but she never forgot. She kept copies, she kept records, she kept screenshots, and most importantly, she kept track of every detail. I didn't know it yet, but those records were about to become very important. Because the silk scarf wasn't the beginning of Reed's secret, it was only the first thing I'd finally noticed. On the 4th day of my recovery, Cora finally sent me a message. She said she'd been keeping an eye on Reed for nearly 2 years, and she believed I deserved to know what she'd discovered. We met at a small coffee shop on Milwaukee Avenue, the first morning I felt strong enough to ride the L by myself. Cora didn't waste time. She placed a manila envelope on the table and pushed it toward me. Inside were 18 months of financial statements from a second business account Reed had secretly opened under the name of a shell company I'd never heard of. The transactions were impossible to ignore. Every month, money had been sent to a luxury apartment building on North Michigan Avenue called the Ashton. The payments were consistent. They had started long before our most recent anniversary. Then I found the other charges: $4,100 at a River North jewelry store, $2,600 at Nordstrom. Both transactions had happened during the same week I'd been desperately trying to stretch our household budget because Reed had told me we couldn't afford to finance an expensive roof repair. The Ashton was only 11 minutes from his office. That fact stayed in my mind. A few weeks later, on a Saturday morning in February, I drove there. I wore an oversized parka and pulled a knit cap low over my face. I had discovered a key card inside the pocket of one of Reed's old North Face jackets weeks earlier. At the time, I'd assumed it belonged to a parking garage connected to his firm. Now I wasn't so sure. The card worked. First, it opened the elevator. Then it unlocked apartment 1108. My stomach tightened as the door opened. The apartment smelled faintly of expensive floral perfume. Everything inside looked new. The walls were bright white. The furniture was arranged in soft blush and ivory tones, carefully selected and unmistakably feminine. Then I saw the photographs. They were displayed beside the dining table. Reed, and a young woman with long auburn hair and a perfectly practiced smile. There was one of them laughing together at a restaurant in the West Loop. Another showed Reed with his arm around her waist. He looked relaxed, happy. I hadn't seen that version of him in years. Then I noticed the coffee table. A baby name book was lying open, covered with sticky notes. The handwriting on several of them was Reed's. My hands went cold. On the kitchen counter sat a letter from an OB-GYN. It confirmed an appointment for a pregnancy that was 17 weeks along. The name on the letter was Giselle Hartley. I took photographs of everything. Strangely, my hands were steady. I think the part of me that had been hoping there was an innocent explanation had finally disappeared. I was standing inside the bedroom when I heard the elevator doors open outside. I had seconds. I slipped into the closet, pulled the door almost shut, and stood silently between two garment bags. My heartbeat sounded deafening. Then the apartment door opened. Giselle walked in first. She was talking about getting Thai food. Reed followed her, and the sound of his voice nearly broke me. It was warm, relaxed, patient, a tone I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. They settled into the living room as naturally as a couple who had repeated the same routine hundreds of times. Then Giselle's voice became serious. "Reed, I'm 4 months pregnant. I need to know what we're actually going to do." Silence. Then I heard him sit beside her. Through the narrow opening in the closet door, I could see him take her hand. His voice changed. It became the voice I'd heard countless times during business negotiations. Calm, deliberate, reassuring on the surface, but designed to control the conversation. "I'm working on it. The problem is the house and the retirement accounts." Then he said something that made my entire body go still. "If I give her divorce papers right now, Illinois law splits everything 50-50. I stopped breathing. He continued, "I've been restructuring everything. There's a property in Scottsdale. I transferred it into my mother's name last month. And I'm showing the development division at a loss until this is settled." His words came slowly. "By the time the divorce is finalized, there won't be much left to divide." Giselle sounded pleased. "And what does she get?" "Enough for a year somewhere cheap," Reed replied. "Maybe $120,000. I'll make it look like I'm being generous." I dug my thumbnail into my palm. $120,000. That was what he thought 4 years of marriage were worth. 4 years of dinners. 4 years of rearranging my work schedule around his. 4 years of carefully managing our household finances while he secretly maintained another apartment and another life only 11 minutes from his office. I recorded every word. When they went into the kitchen to order food, I slipped out. I took the stairs all the way down to the parking level. Once inside my car, I sat there for several minutes before I could convince myself to start the engine. That night, I called Douglas Reeve, an attorney Pam had recommended. She had used him during her own divorce. According to her, Douglas had a particular talent for making complicated financial misconduct impossible to misunderstand in court. I played him the recording. He listened without interrupting. When it ended, he placed his pen on the desk. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "you have a very strong position to start from." Then he told me something I never expected. "Do nothing. Not yet. Let Reed believe everything is normal," he said. "Be the attentive wife. Keep him comfortable. Let him think he's in control." Then he leaned back. "Wait for the right public moment." 4 weeks later, Reed handed me that moment himself. He gave me $5,000 and told me to buy a dress for Meridian Development Group's annual charity gala at the Langham. "The board likes to see family stability during contract renewal season," he said. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His attention stayed on his calendar. And suddenly, I understood what I had been to him. Not a wife, not a partner. A line item, a prop in the presentation. I used the $5,000 for Douglas's legal retainer. For the gala, I wore a dress I already owned. The ballroom was filled with crystal chandeliers, expensive decorations, and conversations about generosity from people holding glasses that cost more than some families' weekly groceries. Reed kept his hand against my back as he moved me around the room. He introduced me to 4 board members within the first half hour. I smiled. I asked the right questions. I laughed at the right moments. And then I saw Giselle. She was there as a consultant, dressed in red, spending the cocktail hour finding convenient reasons to remain close to Reed. I watched him juggle both performances, the devoted husband, the secret lover, and for the first time I could see the strain beginning to show. Then the program director announced the evening's special presentation. I started walking toward the side stage. Reed noticed me. His expression changed for the briefest moment. He recovered quickly and moved toward me, but 2 men stepped into his path. Douglas had arranged them. I reached the microphone. "Thank you so much," I said. My voice was calm, much calmer than I expected. "Reed has dedicated so much of himself to building Meridian over the years." I paused. I thought tonight deserved a presentation that honestly reflected where all that energy has been going. I nodded toward the Avenue booth. The screen behind me came alive. First came the photographs from apartment 1108, the white walls, the blush-colored furniture, Reed and Giselle. Then the baby name book, open to a page filled with Reed's handwriting. Next came the bank statements, dates, amounts, corporate withdrawals, one after another. Finally, the summary appeared. 18 months, 6 figures, money routed through a shell company designed to hide a second life. The room became completely silent. Then I heard a small, broken sound from the very important person table, Roberta Reed's mother. A moment later, the room erupted. Reed reached the stage steps. The 2 men stopped him. He was shouting things I won't repeat. His face had turned bright red, his arm lifted in anger. I simply looked at him. This was the man I had trusted. The man who had driven away from O'Hare that night without even checking his mirror. And standing there, I realized something. The worst part wasn't what he had done. It was realizing that the thing I'd feared most had already happened. And somehow, I was still standing. The aftermath was ugly. Reed's team claimed the documents had been manipulated. Douglas produced the originals, certified records, subpoenaed documents. They claimed I'd fabricated the entire story out of jealousy. Then Cora stepped forward. She provided records documenting the Scottsdale property transfer and the shell company. She had been tracking both for nearly 2 years. Reed's people even tried to twist a photograph from a conference I'd attended in Charlotte, cropping it to make an innocent handshake with a colleague appear suspicious. Douglas obtained the complete conference footage within 48 hours. Their story collapsed. Then came something none of us had expected. The DNA results. I hadn't planned for that. The information surfaced during discovery when Giselle's prenatal records became part of the financial proceedings. Douglas's team compared the available prenatal DNA information with Reed's legally obtained DNA sample. The result was clear. The baby wasn't Reed's. And then I learned something else. Reed had undergone a vasectomy in his early 30s. He had never told me. Not once. Not during 4 years of marriage. 4 years in which I had privately wondered why we hadn't been able to have children. 4 years in which I'd cried alone, believing something was wrong with me. The baby wasn't his. I heard from Cora that Reed confronted Giselle at the Ashton. The confrontation lasted about 12 minutes. Giselle left for Phoenix within the week. Reed reportedly spent hours alone inside the empty pink apartment before finally driving back to the house. A house that, by then, he no longer had any claim to. I didn't feel happy about it. Not even a little. What I felt was exhaustion. The deep exhaustion of someone who has carried something unbearably heavy for years and finally gets permission to put it down. The court awarded me 62% of the marital assets, the Elmhurst house, and additional compensation for the financial and emotional harm involved. The Scottsdale transfer was declared fraudulent and reversed. Reed was removed from Meridian's board while the company conducted a financial review. On the day the judgment was entered, Roberta was waiting outside the courtroom. She grabbed my arm. "You destroyed my son," she said. "You destroyed this family." She told me she'd never forgive me. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve, and suddenly I remembered O'Hare, the freezing slush, my ruined coat, Pam's whiteboard. 10 marks, 10 days of silence. I gently removed her hand. "What we reap usually resembles what we sow," I told her. Then I walked away. Outside, the March air was cold and smelled of wet concrete and melting snow. I took a deep breath. For the first time in years, the air felt clean. I sold the house in May. I kept part of the money, donated some to a domestic violence shelter on Chicago's Northwest Side, and used the rest to accept a place in a graduate program in sustainable design at the University of the Arts London. The acceptance letter had been sitting in my inbox for 3 years. Every time I'd mentioned it, Reed had called it impractical. Now I was going. Pam drove me to O'Hare on a humid July morning. She cried the entire way from the parking garage to the departures entrance. I managed to hold myself together until I passed security. At the gate, I watched the planes move slowly across the gray morning tarmac. And then I thought about January. I had stood in this same airport months earlier believing my entire world was falling apart. But I had survived it. I was still standing. London was gray, fast, crowded, and wonderfully indifferent to my past. I loved it almost immediately. I work hard now, but it feels different. I'm no longer working to make myself smaller so I can fit inside someone else's idea of what my life should be. My apartment near Bloomsbury has terrible water pressure. The radiator makes strange noises all night in November. Some evenings I eat toast for dinner because I forget to go grocery shopping, and somehow I've never felt more like myself. Cora calls every few weeks. She finally got her share of her father's estate properly sorted out. She's using the money to open a bakery in Logan Square. I think that's exactly the right thing to do with money that should have been hers from the beginning. 8 months after our divorce was finalized, Reed sent me a message. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he was working on himself. He hoped I was doing well. I read it twice. Then I closed the app and went back to my thesis model. I'm designing a public library for a neighborhood in South London that hasn't had one in 15 years. Small rooms, tall windows, shelves low enough for children to reach. A courtyard filled with plants so that when spring arrives, it feels like more than another piece of the city. I've learned something through all of this. Some things are meant to be put down and left behind. Other things are worth carrying forward. The real challenge is knowing which is which. In the end, I chose correctly. One morning, I stood before a room full of people who listened carefully when I spoke. Not because they had to, not because I was someone's wife, not because I was part of someone's carefully constructed image. They listened because what I had to say mattered. And finally, I understood what all those months of pain, exhaustion, cold, and patience had been leading me toward. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was something much simpler. It was my life, wide open and completely mine.